The first thing that hit the ground was the stone altar. Not by wind, not by accident. It went down because a man drove the heel of his boot straight through its carved face, and the sound of it, that deep, hollow crack, split through the mourning trees like something that could not be taken back. The wolves standing at the tree line didn't move. They barely breathed, because the man in the middle of that garden wasn't a man anyone argued with. Not openly, not here, not ever. Alpha King Marmon. Richmond stood among the wreckage with his jaw locked and his chest heaving, and his dark eyes carrying the kind of heat that has nothing to do with temperature. He was broad and tall in his formal black coat, the silver wolf crest of the Richmond pack, catching the pale morning light even as ash began to drift across it. The cedar planting beds went next, one after another, tipped and broken open against the earth. Dark soil spread across the stone pathways like something bleeding. White moonflowers, the kind that take 2 full seasons to coax into bloom, the kind that only open at night and face the dark like they understand it, scattered into the dirt like stars that had been knocked from the sky. Hand-shaped clay bowls, every one of them marked with symbols that meant something to someone, shattered across the roots and rocks. A climbing herb arch caught fire. The carved moon and wolf symbol at its peak burned orange, then black, then folded into nothing. Smoke rose slow and silver through the cold morning light, carrying the smell of cedar and crushed herbs and 10 years of careful, patient work rising into the air and disappearing. No, Marmon didn't stop until there was nothing left to destroy. He stood in the middle of it all, breathing hard, hands tight at his sides, dark hair pushed back from the heat of the fire he had made. And in all of that smoke and silence, he looked like a man who had just won something. He was not winning anything. In the center of the ruined garden, Kira Mills knelt in the ash. She had not screamed. She had not begged him to stop. She had not said a single word while a king destroyed everything she had spent the last decade building with her own 2 hands. Her white healer's dress was already stained with soot and soil. Her dark hair fell loose around her face, and her hands, those steady, sure hands, moved through the wreckage the way water moves through stone, slowly, without rushing, picking up one broken moonflower stem, setting it aside, reaching for another. As if she had already decided, long before this morning, exactly where her line was, and no amount of fire was going to move it. Marmon stared at her. Something about that silence, the complete, unshaking quiet of it, unsettled him in a way that surprised him. He had expected crying. He had expected anger. He had expected the kind of desperate pleading that would have made him feel less like he had done something he could not undo. He got none of it. Just a woman in the ash, saving what she could, one stem at a time. He turned and walked out through the tree line without looking back. He told himself he had done what was necessary. He told himself the pack came first. And he told himself that sentiment was not strategy, and that a half-acre of plants wasn't worth the security of 200 wolves who depended on him to make hard choices. His guards fell into step behind him. No one spoke. The smoke kept rising above the eastern trees, and the smell of it followed him all the way back to the compound road. And even then, it did not leave him. He was good at pushing things down. He had been doing it for years. But what none of them knew, not Marmon, not his guards, not a single wolf watching from that tree line, was what that garden had already done for the Richmond bloodline. What none of them knew yet was who Kira Mills truly was. And what Marmon did not yet understand was that the moment he put that garden to ash, he had not cleared an obstacle from his path. He had started a fire that would burn through everything he thought he was. If this story is already pulling at something in you, stay with me, because this is only the beginning. Kira Mills woke before sunrise every morning without an alarm. It was not discipline. It was not habit in the way most people understand habits. It was something older than that. The same instinct that makes plants lean toward light before the sun has even crested the tree line, before the sky has made up its mind about what color it wants to be. She dressed quietly in the small stone house at the garden's edge. Simple clothes, bare feet by the time she reached the first raised bed. The cold of the stone path under her soles was the same cold it had been every morning since she was 7 years old, learning the names of things from a woman with rough hands and a voice like river water. The moon garden covered half an acre and was shaped like an open hand. Each finger of it was a different planting zone, divided by smooth stone pathways her grandmother Leah had laid herself decades ago, one stone at a time, by lantern light, on evenings after the rest of the world had gone quiet. White moon flowers ran along the outer edges, their petals still open from the night, facing upward the way they always did. Patient, steady, certain the dark was worth trusting. At the center stood a stone altar, with 4 carved directional symbols worn smooth by decades of weather and hands. Wooden arches threaded with climbing herbs framed the entrance, and clusters of clay bowls sat throughout the paths, each one marked with symbols Kira could read without thinking, the way other people read words. She walked the rows the way some people pray, slowly, without rushing, touching a leaf here, checking the soil there, pausing at the altar to run her thumb across the carved symbols the way she always did when she needed to feel something solid under her hands. This garden was not just a place. It was the most honest record of everything her grandmother had believed about the world, that living things deserve attention, that healing is not something you do to a person, but something you do with them, and that the earth remembers kindness, even when people forget it. Kira had taken that seriously enough that she had turned down a position at the Richmond PAC's official healer wing. Twice. At both times she gave the same reason without apology. The people who needed her most were the ones who would never walk through those compound gates. Lorelei Conway came on a Tuesday in September, 2 months before the letters started arriving. She was young, 22, maybe 23, and she arrived at Kira's gate at dusk, with her mate's jacket pulled too tight around her shoulders, and her eyes doing the thing eyes do when someone has been crying for longer than they want to admit. She had been pregnant. Something had gone wrong during the labor. Not dangerously. Not the kind of wrong that makes people rush and shout, but the quiet kind of wrong that leaves a woman feeling like her body had failed a test she hadn't known she was taking. The compound healers had seen her, treated her. They sent her home with medicine and a printed sheet of instructions. They had done everything correctly. They had not once, asked her how she was doing apart from the wound. Kira made tea. She sat across from Lorelei in the garden's small stone kitchen, and she listened for an hour before she reached for a single herb. Lorelei, I keep waiting to feel like myself again, and I don't know if I'm grieving something or just broken. Kira had looked at her steadily. Kira, you're not broken. You went through something hard, and nobody gave you room to say so. That's different. Lorelei Conway had gone home that evening with a small, wrapped bundle of dried herbs, and the kind of steadiness in her shoulders that comes from having been genuinely heard. She brought dried flowers from her garden a month later as a thank you, and Kira had accepted them and said nothing about payment because there was none. There was also Ephraim Turlow, who was 64 years old and had been coming to the eastern gate every winter for 4 years because his joints seized in the cold, and the compound's medical fees had become something he carefully did not think about. He knew which bench to sit on. He knew Kira would have the fire going and the deep root compress already warming. And there was the pack runner, whose name Kira never asked. He had arrived at the gate 3 weeks ago at 2 in the morning, with nothing wrong that showed from the outside, and everything wrong that didn't. He had sat in the garden for 2 hours in complete silence, and then walked home. That was all. Sometimes that was all a person needed, a place that held still while they fell apart a little. But Kira charged none of them. She told no one about any of them. Her grandmother's voice was always there when she worked. Healing is not a transaction, it is a response. Someone needs you. You respond. That is all. Leah Mills had said that in 100 different ways across the years of Kira's growing up. She had said it in her kitchen over the herb sorting, said it in the garden rows at dusk, said it in the quiet moments before dawn when Kira was very young and would sit on the altar stone and ask questions about why the world worked the way it did. Leah was gone now. 3 years gone. But the garden was still here. Kira was still here. And the work continued. Winnie Brock arrived mid-morning with 2 cups of tea she had made in Kira's own kitchen without asking, which was simply how Winnie operated in every space she entered. She was sharp-faced and warm-eyed, and the kind of loyal that showed up without being called. She settled herself on the stone garden wall with the ease of someone who had been sitting on that wall for years, because she had, and she looked at Kira over the rim of her cup with the specific expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something she had already decided to say. Winnie. 4 times market value, Kira. You understand what that number looks like written down? Kira was checking the root depth on the moonflower cuttings along the east bed. She did not look up. Kira. I understand what it looks like. It's still not the garden. Winnie. He's going to come himself eventually. You know that, right? Men like Mom and Richmond don't stay behind a letter when the letter stops working. Kira was quiet for a moment. Or the cuttings were healthy. The roots were deep. She moved on to the next section. Kira. I know. Winnie studied her. There was something in the way Kira said it, not resigned, not afraid, just perfectly still, that told Winnie this was not a woman who had failed to think the situation through. This was a woman who had thought it all the way to the end, and made her peace with wherever it landed. Kira had known Marmon would come from the moment the first letter arrived. She had known it the way she knew weather, not from looking at the sky, but from something in the air that changed before the clouds did. Men who had never been told no in any way that held did not accept no from a handwritten note. They came in person because they believed presence was its own kind of pressure. What Kira had not told Winnie, what she had not told anyone, was what she had done 6 weeks ago in the Richmond compound, in the dark, when no one was watching. She kept that to herself, the way she kept everything that mattered. Close and quiet, wrapped around the roots of her like the deep soil around a plant that has survived its first hard winter. That evening, alone, Kira took the leather journal down from the shelf above the kitchen table. The spine had cracked from reading. The pages had softened at the corners the way pages do when they have been turned by the same hands many times, in many different kinds of light. Between herb notes and moon cycle records and healing accounts with names carefully removed, Kira found the entry she always found herself returning to, but the one her grandmother had written in a different season, a different year, about a different night that had nonetheless made its way into this one. She did not read it aloud. She did not need to. She knew it the way she knew the garden paths, by feel, in the dark, without needing to look. She had known exactly who Isaac Richmond was the night she slipped through the compound fence. She had read the journal. She understood the weight of that bloodline and what it had once meant to her grandmother. She went anyway, not because of what the Richmond name meant, because the child was 8 years old and he was dying and she could help. There was no calculation in it. The moment you start calculating, her grandmother had taught her, the healing stops being healing and starts being something smaller. She closed the journal. They set it back on the shelf, blew out the lamp. Outside, the moonflowers were opening in the dark, steady and white and patient, and the garden was as quiet as it always was at the end of the day, when all the work was done, and the only thing left to do was trust that the roots would hold until morning. Stay with this story, because what's coming next will make you understand exactly what was lost, and exactly why it mattered. 6 weeks before the fire, on a night in October when the leaves had turned and the compound smelled of wood smoke and something else, something sharp and wrong, Isaac Richmond collapsed. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his grandmother Valerie's stubborn chin and a habit of asking questions about everything until the person he was asking either gave him a real answer or admitted they didn't have one. He had been at the dinner table in the main gathering hall, and then he had been on the floor between the table and the kitchen doorway, and for a moment nobody moved because nobody could believe what they were seeing. Then everyone moved at once. The compound healers worked for 2 days. They worked with everything they had, and they were good at what they did, skilled and trained and thorough, and still, on the morning of the second day, they came to Marmon with careful faces and careful words about a poison they could identify, but could not fully counter, moving at a pace that did not give them the time they needed. Marmon stood outside Isaac's locked door from the moment they had moved his son inside until the moment they told him it was safe to enter. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He stood in that corridor with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it had learned to do across 13 years of being watched, absolutely still, absolutely controlled, absolutely giving away nothing. Underneath that stillness, Marmon Richmond was the most frightened he had been since he was 26 years old, standing in a different corridor outside a different room, waiting to be told his father was gone. This was worse. This was not grief he had been preparing for without knowing it. This was the specific, terrible fear of a parent watching time move wrong. Isaac survived. On the morning of the third day, the healers came out with different faces, still careful, but lightened at the edges, and reported that the boy had stabilized, that his blood work had shifted in ways they were struggling to explain, that his recovery was, by any measure they had available, extraordinary. They attributed it to bloodline strength, to the natural resilience of a pure Richmond wolf. Marmon accepted that explanation because he needed to, because the alternative, that something had happened that his best healers could not account for, was not a thought he could afford to hold for long when there were security failures to address and threats to investigate, and a pack that needed its alpha to be certain. 3 weeks after Isaac's recovery, Marmon stood in the strategy room with his land manager, Ralph Haskins, his chief intelligence advisor, Harlan Doolin, and his long-trusted inner advisor, Clovis Lambert, spread across a territory map that showed the proposed eastern perimeter expansion in clean, precise lines. The logic was sound. The security breach that allowed the poisoning had come through the eastern approach. A fortified training ring on that side of the compound would give the guard rotation room to breathe, would create a controlled perimeter, would prevent any future intrusion from that direction. The architects had drawn it. The engineers had confirmed it. Every parcel of land required fell within Richmond Holdings, with one exception. Ralph Haskins. The half-acre at the eastern tree line belongs to Kira Mills, healer. The land's been in her family for 30 years. She's been living and working there since her grandmother passed. Marmon. Send her an offer. Market value. To 2 weeks to respond. Ralph had nodded and written it down and said nothing else, because that was what Ralph did. He executed decisions carefully and kept his opinions for moments when they were genuinely needed. He was good at knowing the difference. Clovis Lambert had said nothing either. He stood at the window with his arms folded, and if there was something particular in his expression as he watched Marmon look at the map, it was the kind of particular that went unnoticed in a room focused on other things. What Marmon did not know, what no one in that room knew except Lambert himself, was that there were 2 fully workable alternate perimeter configurations sitting in a folder on Lambert's desk that had never been placed on the strategy table. They had been quietly excluded from the assessments because the men who had manufactured the crisis needed the expansion to be urgent, specific, and aimed directly at that half-acre. They needed Marmon to feel cornered. They needed him to move. The first offer came back with a handwritten note. Polite, clear, 2 sentences. The land was not for sale. The second offer, double the first, came back the same way. Polite, clear, still no. The third, 4 times the original amount, arrived with a 3-sentence reply that thanked Marmon for his continued interest, confirmed the garden was not available at any price, and wished the Richmond pack well. Ralph placed all 3 notes on Marmon's desk on a Tuesday afternoon and stood quietly on the other side of it. Ralph Haskins. She's not negotiating. She's not asking for more, or she genuinely doesn't want to move. Marmon. Everyone moves eventually. Ralph said nothing after that. He had been with Marmon long enough to know that sometimes silence was the most honest response available. Marmon's mother found him that evening at the east-facing study window with a glass of water he had not touched, and the kind of stillness around his shoulders that she had learned to read over 39 years as a sign that he was holding something he had not yet decided whether to name. Valerie Richmond was silver-haired and composed, and had the posture of a woman who had made a discipline of choosing which battles to join. She stood beside her son for a long moment, without speaking, because she had always understood that silence could be a gift when offered at the right time. Then she said, quietly, Valerie, the Willis Garden. It was not a question. Marmon, it's in the way. Valerie looked out the window. Her voice stayed level, but something behind it shifted. Valerie, that garden has been in that spot for 30 years, Marmon. It was not in anyone's way until 3 weeks ago. I want you to think very carefully before you push that woman further than you already have. Marmon, you know her? Valerie, I knew her grandmother. She left the study without adding anything else. And Marmon stood at the window for a long time after she was gone, looking east toward the tree line, trying to understand what it was in his mother's voice that had felt like a door closing very softly. He told himself he would listen when he went. He genuinely believed it in that moment. At what he did not account for was the way months of accumulated pressure can transform a man's intentions between the morning he makes them and the morning he acts on them. He did not account for what it does to a person, even a strong one. to carry fear in silence for long enough. He came to the garden the next morning without his full guard detail. 2 men at the tree line, as close to alone as an Alpha King ever travelled. He had come from a council session and was still in his formal coat with the wolf crest, and later, much later, he would think about how that must have looked. A fully armoured man walking into a healer's sanctuary. A man arriving at a conversation with his authority already on display. Kira was tending the altar bed when he arrived. She finished what she was doing with her hands before she straightened and turned to face him. She was younger than the letters had suggested. The steadiness in her writing had read like age, like someone who had lived long enough to arrive at a permanent kind of calm. But she was 26, and her eyes were dark and clear, and held his gaze without a single flicker of the deference he had long stopped noticing he expected. Marmon. I thought we should speak directly, Kira. We could have, 3 letters ago. He pulled the 4th offer from inside his coat, higher than the 3rd, significantly higher. She looked at it without reaching for it. Kira, I'm not going to read that. Marmon. It's more than fair, Kira. I'm sure it is. The number isn't the problem. He kept his voice controlled. He was still, in that moment, trying. Marmon. Then what is the problem? She looked at him with the specific steadiness of someone who has thought through every version of this conversation and arrived at the same place each time. Kira. This garden was planted by my grandmother before I was born. She built it on ground nobody else wanted. She healed wolves here that your compound turned away. She died here. I grew up here. I have tended every plant in this soil for 10 years. This is not a piece of land. You cannot purchase what this is. Something in Marmon tightened. It was not one feeling. It was 12 months compressed into a single moment. The investors, the permits, the security failures he had not been able to explain to the outer pack without admitting a vulnerability he couldn't afford to admit. Isaac's face on that corridor floor, the locked room. But the 2 days of standing still while his son's life moved in a direction he could not control, the weight of all of it pressing against his ribs like a stone he had been carrying since October. And then she said, "Your grandmother is gone." No. He said it. He said it to her. He heard his own voice say it, and something in him said, "Stop." Said, "This is wrong." Said, "Put it down." He swept his arm across the nearest planting table. Clay bowls hit the ground. Soil exploded across the stone. Herbs scattered everywhere. He did not fully decide what came next. It moved through him the way a wave moves when the wall has already cracked, and he let it, because stopping it would have required sitting with what was underneath, and he had spent months not doing that. He overturned the cedar planting beds. He tore the climbing arch from its post. He pulled the torch lantern from the eastern archway and put it to the dry wood before either of his guards understood what was happening. The fire took quickly, and in the middle of all of it, Kira dropped to her knees in the dirt and started gathering stems. One at a time. Her hands didn't shake. Marmon stood in the burning garden and breathed hard, and the only sound was the fire and the slow roll of the last clay bowl across the stone path until it came to rest against a root. He walked out without looking at her again. What you're feeling right now, hold on to it, because the truth has not arrived yet. And when it does, it will change every single thing. 3 hours after the fire, Rika Finch requested an audience with the Alpha King. This was unusual. Rika worked in the compound's medical archives, a careful, the thorough woman who moved through the compound's background with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her invisible to everyone who wasn't paying attention. The inner circle treated her like furniture. This was their mistake, and hers was one of the compound's better-kept assets, because furniture sees everything. She came into Marmon's outer office with a folder of medical records and waited until Ralph confirmed Marmon would see her. Then she walked in, placed the folder on his desk, and stood behind it. Rika Finch. There is something you need to know about Isaac's recovery. Marmon looked up from the land assessment he had been staring at without reading. Rika Finch. The compound healers recorded a recovery they couldn't explain. I filed the case summary myself. But there were elements in Isaac's blood work during recovery that didn't come from any treatment we administered. I flagged them as anomalies and set them aside because I had no context for them. Now I do. She opened the folder and pulled a separate page from the back. It was a healer's notation in neat, careful handwriting, written on plain paper and filed anonymously at the compound's eastern gate 2 days after Isaac had stabilized. She placed it in front of Marmon. Rika Finch. Someone left this without a name or a return. I found it in the archive intake and nearly filed it without reading it. It describes a healing intervention using night-root compound and lunar cycle timing applied during the peak of Isaac's crisis. The procedure requires plant components that only grow in cultivated form in this territory, and it requires something else. She paused, because what she was about to say was not something she had said aloud before. Rika Finch. It requires the healer to contribute their own blood as an activation element. The technique is old. The compound has no training for it, and that contribution would have carried a significant physical cost to whoever performed it. Marmon looked at the notation. Then he looked at it again. Marmon. Who wrote this? Rika Finch. The night-root components described only grow in cultivated form in one place in this territory, a moon garden on the eastern border. The room was completely quiet. Outside the east window, a thread of smoke was still visible through the tree line. Rika Finch. I believe Kira Mills saved Isaac's life 6 weeks ago. She came to the compound in the night. She identified his room by the boy's scent. She administered the treatment through an open window, filed this notation after the fact, and told no one. She used her own blood. She asked for nothing in return. No recognition, no money, no protection for her land. Nothing. The silence in the room was different now. Rika set the second page of the folder beside the first. The blood work analysis, the anomaly flags, the precise chemical match between Isaac's recovery markers and the compound described in the anonymous notation, and then she stepped back. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The afternoon light moved across the desk. Marmon sat in his chair and read the file once. He read it again. He set it down and looked at his hands. The same hands that had swept clay bowls off a table that morning, that had torn an herb arch from its post, that had put a flame to dry cedar, while a woman kneeled in the dirt behind him. Down the hall, Isaac was asleep. Alive. A boy who had been 8 years old and dying, and who had woken up on the 3rd morning breathing steadily, blood work shifting in ways trained healers had called extraordinary, and written off as bloodline strength. Marmon now knew what it actually was. He did not move for a long time. He was not a man practiced at naming the specific feeling that arrives when a person realizes they have done something irreversible to someone who did not deserve it. 13 years of being Alpha King had trained him to move through decisions and past them, to act, to commit, to absorb the cost and keep going. Stillness was not something he had made room for, but it was here now, sitting across from him in that empty study, and it was not going anywhere. The file on his desk said his son had survived because of the woman whose garden he had just spent 3 hours destroying. The smoke was still visible through the eastern window. He stayed in that chair until dark came, and even then he did not move, and even then, something else was also present in that room. Something quieter than guilt, something that surprised him with its warmth. He kept seeing her in the ash, the white dress, the steady hands, the way she had gathered stems without crying, without asking anything of him, as if she had already decided that what happened next was entirely between herself and the ground beneath her. He had known women who performed composure. He had spent his adult life surrounded by people who wore strength as a costume, but he did not know what to do with someone who simply had it, deep and real and rooted, and who had extended that strength not just to her own suffering, but to his son's life, in the dark, without asking for his approval or his gratitude or even his awareness. He told himself the feeling was respect. He told himself that, and he almost believed it. The next morning, he came to the garden without armor. That detail mattered to him. He could not have explained precisely why, except that it felt like the only honest choice available, to come without the visual weight of authority, to stand in what he had done without the borrowed protection of a title. Simple dark clothing, no crest, no guard detail at the tree line, or just Marmon Richmond walking into a ruined garden with nothing in his hands and nothing to offer except the words he had been turning over since before sunrise. Kira was already there. She had been there since before the sun came up, the neighbors said. Or rather, they would have said it if any of them had thought to ask. She had cleared the debris into neat piles. She had salvaged roughly a third of what remained. The moonflower stems she had gathered during the fire itself, a handful of undamaged herbs from the beds farthest from the arch, a few clay bowl fragments she was studying as if deciding whether they could be repaired. She heard him coming and did not turn. Marmon. Kira. She kept working. Marmon. What I did here yesterday was wrong. It was not leadership and it was not justice, and I cannot call it anything other than what it was. She was quiet for a long moment. She set a stone carefully in its place before she answered. Kira. Okay. He had expected something. Argument. Acceptance. He had not expected the word to be that small and that complete. Marmon. I'll pay for reconstruction. Any amount. I can have a team here within the week. Kira. No. He paused. Kira. Money doesn't replant a 30-year-old moonflower. A construction team doesn't know how to rebuild what this was. I don't want your team, and I don't want your money, and I don't want a fast fix that lets you close a record on this. Her voice was not raised. It was very, very level. He crouched to the ground, which was not something he did often, because it put him at her level, and that felt necessary. Marmon, I know about Isaac. Her hands paused, just for a fraction of a second. Then they kept moving. Kira. That had nothing to do with the land. Marmon. I know. Kira. I didn't do it for protection or recognition. I did it because he was a child, and he was dying, and I could help. She stopped. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time since he had come back, with the careful distance gone, just 2 people in the ash of something. Kira. Think about what kind of leader does what you did. Not to me, to this pack. The people who come here at night because they have nowhere else to go. When you've actually thought about that, not explained it away, not justified it, then maybe we can talk again. He stood. He looked at the ruined garden and at the woman quietly rebuilding it with no help and no instruction and no expectation. He left slower than he had arrived. The certainty he had come with was not with him anymore. Something about her directness stayed with him all the way back. Not the words. The absence behind them. The way she had said them without wanting anything from him. Not even an apology, really. Just honesty. Just the truth. Plainly offered. And whatever he chose to do with it was between him and himself. He could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him that way. He was not sure he had ever found it so hard to leave a place. The story is not done with either of them. Stay with me, because the next truth is about to arrive from a direction neither of them expected. 2 days after Marmon's first return, Valerie Richmond came to the ruined garden alone. She came in the early afternoon, dressed in a dark wool coat, with her silver hair pinned at her neck, and her posture carrying the particular straightness of a woman who has walked somewhere difficult before, and knows how to hold herself upright while doing it. She passed the broken entrance arch without stopping. She moved into the cleared space slowly, the way a person moves through a place they are trying to remember, scanning the salvaged herb piles, the broken altar, the careful order Kira had imposed on what was left of everything. Kira looked up when she heard the footsteps. She recognized Valerie Richmond, the way you recognize someone you have studied in a photograph long before meeting them. Her grandmother had mentioned Valerie once, briefly, and in a journal entry that Kira had read so many times, the page had gone soft at the edges. She knew what this woman's presence here meant. She also knew this was not a visit to be rushed. Valerie stopped at the edge of the cleared area. She looked at the broken altar base. She crouched slightly and touched the carved symbol, still visible on the split stone face. Valerie Richmond. This is Leah's mark? Not a question, a recognition. Valerie Richmond. I knew your grandmother. Not well, but in the kind of way that stays. Kira was still. She set down the herb bundle she had been sorting. What Valerie told her next was quiet and unhurried. Told the way people tell things they have held private for years and have finally chosen to release, not because the time is right, but because the debt has become too large to carry alone. But 23 years ago, Valerie Richmond had been sick in the kind of way the compound's healers could not fix. Not a dramatic illness, nothing that announced itself loudly. A slow, bone-deep exhaustion, paired with something deteriorating in her lungs, that every healer she saw diagnosed correctly and treated carefully, and watched worsen regardless. Marmon had been 15. His father had been carrying that fear the way he carried everything, with the stone-faced endurance of a man who believed that strength meant not letting anyone see you bend. Valerie had run out of places to go. She had tried everything the compound offered. She had tried twice what the compound offered. And then, as on a January night when the cold front had moved in and the temperature had dropped, and she was sitting with the particular quiet desperation of someone who has stopped expecting things to get better. Someone in the outer pack, a quiet woman she barely knew, had leaned across a table and said, softly, "There's a woman at the eastern border. She doesn't turn people away." Valerie had come to the garden on a night that was too cold and too dark to be doing anything sensible, and she had knocked on the door of the small stone house, and Leah Mills had opened it at 11 o'clock in the middle of a cold front, and looked at her the way she must have looked at every person who arrived at her door at a desperate hour, without surprise, without judgment, without performing welcome. "Leah Mills, come in. Sit down, or let me make you tea while you tell me what's happening." And Valerie Richmond, who had not cried in front of anyone since her diagnosis, who had maintained the composed face of an alpha's mate through every difficult appointment and every careful prognosis, had sat in that small kitchen and wept, because she had finally found someone who was listening instead of treating. The healing took 4 sessions over 6 weeks. Leah Mills came to each one prepared and unhurried and entirely present. She charged nothing. When Valerie tried to leave money on the table, Leah moved it back. Leah Mills: "Some healings are not priced. The only thing I want is for you to carry this kindness forward. That's all." Valerie had carried it. She had carried it for 23 years. And then she had watched her son burn the garden where that kindness had been given. She looked at Kira now in the ruined clearing, and something in her expression was the specific weight of a woman who understands what she failed to prevent. Valerie Richmond. He doesn't know. Not about me. Not about what this place was before he decided it was in his way. I said too little too early. I should have told him everything the moment the first letter came. That is something I will carry. Kira looked at the broken altar for a moment before she answered. Kira, we all carry things. The question is whether they make us better or heavier. Valerie absorbed that. Then quietly, Valerie Richmond. He will make this right. Kira, I hope so, for his sake. After Valerie left, Kira stood alone at the altar base for a long time, where the afternoon light moved across the stones. A small wind came through the tree line and moved the surviving herbs in the salvage piles, and then was gone. Something had shifted in her, not toward forgiveness, not yet, not cleanly, but toward the possibility of it, toward the idea that the story she was living in was larger than the morning it had broken open, and that the man who had destroyed her garden was not only what he had done, he was also the 15-year-old boy who had stood in a corridor outside a locked door, not knowing if his mother would survive it. He was also the father who had stood in a different corridor, not sleeping, watching time move wrong. He was also the man who had come back without armor and crouched to the ground and said plainly that what he had done was wrong. She was not ready to forgive him, but she was no longer certain that was the only thing she was. That night, she took the journal down again. She opened it to the page she knew by memory, and she read it one more time anyway, because sometimes you need to see a thing written in someone else's hand to believe it is still true. Her grandmother had written about Valerie Richmond in a winter 23 years ago. She had written about the knock at the door and the cold night and the woman who sat in her kitchen and cried for the first time in months. She had written about the healing and the 4 sessions and the money she had moved back across the table. She had written, "I told her the only payment I want is for the kindness to keep moving. That's what healing is supposed to do. It is supposed to travel. Or a kindness that stops at the person who receives it is only half a kindness." Kira closed the journal. She had known exactly who Isaac Richmond was the night she slipped through the compound fence. She had read this entry. She had understood the weight of it. The history between her grandmother's hands and the family in that compound. She had gone anyway. Not because of history. Not because of debt. Because the child was 8 years old and he was dying and she could help. The moment you attach a purpose to a kindness, it becomes something smaller. She believed that. She still believed it. She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the garden breathing outside the window. And somewhere in the outer beds, one of the surviving moonflowers opened its face to the night sky, patient and white and entirely without grievance. We're only halfway through. The conspiracy hasn't come to light yet. The justice hasn't arrived. But something else is quietly beginning. Something neither of them has named yet. Keep watching. Harlan Doolin had spent 9 years as Marmon Richmond's chief intelligence advisor, and in 9 years he had learned exactly when to speak and when to move quietly, and when to place something in front of a man and let the thing speak for itself. He came to Marmon's study on a Thursday evening with 3 names on a folded piece of paper and set it on the desk without ceremony. Marmon unfolded it. "Read the names." The temperature in the room dropped in the way that has nothing to do with air. "Marmon, you're certain?" Harlan Doolin. "I don't bring names to you unless I'm certain." The 3 names were Bess Turlow, Clyde Voss, Clovis Lambert. At Bess Turlow, senior Pack Council member, a woman Marmon had trusted with territory law for 6 years. Clyde Voss, outer council representative, quiet, reliable, had served on the security committee since before Marmon took the throne. Clovis Lambert, Marmon's long-trusted inner advisor, the man who had stood at his left hand at pack gatherings for 4 years, the man who had stood at the strategy room window with his arms folded and said nothing while the eastern expansion was planned, and said nothing while alternate configurations were excluded from the table. Harlan laid the documentation across the desk methodically. Cross-referenced access logs, kitchen schedules from the night of the gathering where Isaac had collapsed, the compound's internal event records, the precise supplier chain for the compound used in the poisoning, were traced back through 3 intermediaries to a purchase record with Lambert's authorization code attached. The intent had never been to kill Isaac outright. The intent had been to create a sustained crisis, a visible leadership emergency that would expose Marmon to pressure from every direction simultaneously, fracture confidence in the bloodline succession, and open the territory to a discussion about an alternative future that 3 people had decided was in their interest. Marmon. The security report. The one that started the expansion. Harlan Doolin. Influenced. The urgency in the timeline was manufactured. You weren't wrong to want better security after Isaac's poisoning, but you were steered toward a specific solution on a specific clock that served someone else entirely. Marmon sat back. De Marmon. The alternate configurations. Harlan Doolin. 2 of them. Both workable. Both excluded from every briefing Lambert attended. The room was very quiet. Harlan waited with the patience of someone who understands that certain truths need a moment of silence to fully arrive. Marmon sat with it. The expanded perimeter had never needed to touch Kira's garden. He had been guided there, carefully, slowly, by people he had trusted absolutely, and the urgency he had felt, the pressure that had built over months until it cracked open on a cold morning in a half-acre of herbs and fire. That urgency had been built for him. It had been designed with his specific weaknesses in mind, his need to act, his inability to sit still with uncertainty, his fear, compressed and unnamed, finding the nearest outlet. He looked at the folder, at the names, at the months of careful, patient maneuvering that had ended with a woman kneeling in the ash of her grandmother's work. He had done many difficult things as Alpha King. He had sent wolves into situations that frightened him, made decisions that cost people things they could not get back, stood in rooms where the right choice was invisible and made a choice anyway, and lived with it. But sitting in that study at that hour, he could not think of a single decision he had made in 13 years that felt as complete and irreversible as this one. He stood at the east-facing window for a long time after Harlan left. The tree line was just visible in the last light of the evening. He could not see the garden from here. It was too far, too hidden by the trees, but he knew it was there. He had known it was there every day since the fire, in the way you are aware of a wound even when you are not looking at it. He thought about Kira in the ash. He thought about Rika's file. He thought about his mother's face at the carved symbol on the broken altar stone. He thought about Isaac in the garden bed 3 afternoons ago, asking Kira questions about root depth with the absolute focus of a child who had decided plants were important and was not prepared to be told otherwise. He thought about a boy who was alive down the hall, who should not have survived October, and about the woman who had made that possible in the dark and then gone home without a word. Marmon. Call a pack gathering. 3 days from now. Full council, outer ring, every wolf in the territory who wants to attend. Ralph Haskins, who had been standing quietly by the door for the last 20 minutes, in the way Ralph often stood, available without announcing himself, wrote it down and left to make the arrangements. Marmon stayed at the window. He was going to name what he had done. Publicly, in the stone ring, in front of everyone. He was going to name the 3 men responsible for Isaac's poisoning and the manufactured crisis and the stolen configurations that had never been placed on the strategy table. He was going to invoke the old law that had never been repealed, only ignored. And he was going to say, in front of the entire territory, what Kira Mills was and what she deserved. Not because it would fix what he had done, but because it was the truth, and the truth was the only thing he had left to offer that had not already been given and rejected. He also made a quieter decision in that same hour. A private one. He was going back to the garden, not the next morning, and not to offer anything, just to be present in the wreckage, to pick up a stone and carry it and understand, through the weight of it, what it meant to rebuild something that had been torn down by your own hands. Winnie Brock arrived at the garden 2 evenings before the gathering without announcement, which was standard Winnie procedure. She found Kira sorting salvaged herb cuttings by the lantern in the storage corner, and sat down across from her, in the way that meant she was staying until something was said. Winnie. There's a pack gathering in 2 days. Full ring. Something significant is happening. Kira kept sorting. She did not look up immediately. Kira. I heard. Winnie. I think you should be there. Now Kira looked up. Winnie. Whatever happens, you've lived on this territory your whole life, and you've never once stood in that ring. Whatever he says, whatever gets named, you have the right to hear it. Don't let someone else carry your story out of that clearing. Kira was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the herbs in her hands, then set them down carefully. Kira. All right? Winnie nodded, satisfied. She stood to leave and then paused at the doorway. Winnie. For what it's worth, he came back without his armor. That means something. Kira did not answer that. But after Winnie left, she sat in the lantern light for a long time, and something in her expression was more open than it had been a week ago. More still. The kind of still that comes not from closing off, but from finally deciding what to hold on to. The gathering is coming. The truth is about to stand in the center of the stone ring in front of every wolf in the territory. Hold on. The great clearing behind the Richmond compound lay under a pale morning sky that had not yet decided whether it was winter or only pretending. The old stone ring, granite slabs set into the earth by Marmon's grandfather's hands in a time before the compound had its current walls, stood the way it had always stood. Patient. Solid. Older than the politics being performed around it. They came from across the territory. Compound workers and inner council members arrived first, as they always did. Then the outer ring families, and some of whom had travelled since before sunrise. Then the edge wolves, the ones who lived in the far quarters of the territory, who kept to themselves as a rule, who did not attend these gatherings unless they felt something pull at them that they could not ignore. The word had travelled. The way word always travelled through a pack, on scent and shared instinct and the particular electricity that moves through a community when something significant is about to be acknowledged. Nobody had announced the specifics. Nobody needed to. Kira arrived with Winnie and stood near the back of the gathering in a clean white dress that carried the faint smell of cedar and dried herbs and the garden's particular kind of mourning. She had never stood in this ring before. She stood in it now the way she stood in everything, quietly, completely, or taking it all in. The outer pack wolves recognized her. Some of them had been to her gate. Some of them had sat in her garden in the dark with things they had needed to set down. They nodded at her without words, which was its own kind of language, and she nodded back. He entered the ring last. He was not in armor. He wore the formal dark coat of Alpha authority, the one reserved for occasions that required gravity rather than combat. But there were no battle elements, no crests on his shoulders, no weapons visible. The elder wolves in the crowd registered this the moment he stepped through. They murmured to each other, low and reading, and what they said to each other was, "He has not come to command. He has come to account." Marmon walked to the center of the ring and let the silence settle the way a stone settles in still water, completely, and then in circles. When he spoke, it was about the garden first. "Marmon, 12 days ago, I destroyed a healing sanctuary on the eastern border of this territory. I destroyed it in a moment of uncontrolled anger because it was in my way, and because I had convinced myself that my urgency was more important than its value. I was wrong. Not strategically wrong. Not wrong in a way that can be excused by circumstance or pressure or the difficulty of the position I hold. Wrong in the way a leader is wrong when he uses his power against someone who deserved his protection. I am telling you that plainly, in this ring, because it is the truth, and this is the place where truth is supposed to be spoken." The clearing was absolutely still. Marmon let the words stand without softening them. "Marmon, the moon garden on the eastern border has served this pack for 30 years. The woman who tends it, Kira Mills, is a healer whose grandmother's work extended to members of this pack and to members of my own family in ways I was not fully informed of until recently. She also saved my son's life in October. She did it secretly, in the night, at significant personal cost, without asking for anything in return. The fact that I was not informed of this before I burned her garden is not her failure. It is mine." The sound that moved through the crowd then was not a gasp and not a murmur. It was the sound of an entire community updating its understanding of a situation at the same time. Marmon let it move and then settle before he continued. Harlan Doolin stepped forward. He read from the documentation with the precise, unhurried delivery of a man who has assembled facts carefully and trusts them to do their own work. The 3 names came into the morning air like stones dropped in succession. Bess Turlow, Clyde Voss, Clovis Lambert. The details followed. The poisoning, the access records, the manufactured security timeline, the 2 withheld perimeter configurations that would have made Kira's garden entirely irrelevant to the expansion. All of it read clearly, without drama, without embellishment. The facts were dramatic enough. Somewhere in the crowd, all 3 men stood. They did not run, but there was nowhere in the territory to run to. Marmon looked at them once, the kind of long, level look that says everything that words would only diminish. "Marmon, you will answer to Pack law fully for what you did to my son, and to this territory. There is no version of this that ends differently." Then he turned, and what he said next was not for the 3 men standing in the crowd. It was for the whole territory, and it was also, quietly, for one person standing near the back in a white dress. Marmon. Under traditional pack law, which remains active in this territory, regardless of how long it has been set aside, the healing grounds on the eastern border are designated as protected sanctuary. I am invoking that protection formally today, in front of this gathering. Kira Mills's land cannot be claimed, developed, or touched by any Richmond authority, now or in any future administration, without her explicit consent. Additionally, I am publicly naming her as the pack's official Eastern healer. Not because she asked. She did not. Because it is accurate. Because this pack has owed her that recognition for years, and the delay of that acknowledgement is a failure that ends today. The outer pack wolves moved first. The sound they made, the deep, resonant affirmation that passes through wolves when something true has been named, began at the edges of the clearing and moved inward in a wave. It was not applause. It was older than applause. It was the sound of a community saying, "Yes, this is right. This is what we are supposed to be." Kira stood at the back of the clearing and looked at the ground for a long moment. Then she looked up, but there were no tears. She did not need them. She had not come to this gathering for a performance of justice. She had come to witness it, and she was witnessing it now, and it was exactly what it needed to be. Winnie, beside her, squeezed her hand once and said very quietly, "Winnie, well, it's about time." Across the clearing, from the center of the stone ring, Marmon's eyes found hers through the crowd. He held that gaze for a long moment. Just a moment, before he looked forward again. Something passed between them that was not forgiveness yet. Not quite that. But it was the beginning of something, the ground floor of it, the first stone in a path that was only now becoming visible. We're nearly at the end, but the most important scene is still ahead, and it has nothing to do with justice. It has everything to do with two people, a stone wall and a cup of tea in January. The morning after the gathering, Marmon came to the garden before the work crew he had arranged. He was wearing plain dark clothes, no crest, no coat of authority, nothing that announced who he was beyond his own presence. There was soil on his hands from the previous afternoon, which he had spent moving stones in the compound's practice grounds, not because the practice grounds needed it, but because he had wanted to understand the weight of them, what it felt like to carry a stone from one place to another and set it down deliberately. Kira was already there. Of course she was. She looked at his hands when he arrived, at the soil, at the absence of armor and urgency, and the particular kind of forward lean that she had come to associate with him, the way he occupied space as though movement were a form of certainty. He was not doing any of that now. He was just standing at the edge of the cleared area, waiting to see what she would allow. "Marmon, you don't have to let me help. The crew I've arranged is more than capable." "Kira, I know that." A pause. "Marmon, sending a crew is doing the right thing. Showing up is something else." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not warm yet. Not welcoming exactly. But open in the way a window is open when someone has decided the room needs air. She picked up a stone from the sorting pile and held it out to him. She pointed to the path border that needed resetting along the east side, or she did not say anything else about it. He took the stone. Kira watched him crouch down at the path edge and begin the work, unhurried, careful, paying attention to the way the stones fit together and adjusting when they didn't. She had expected him to be performatively good at it, the way powerful people perform competence when they want to be seen making an effort. He was not performing. He was simply working. And there was something in that, in the straightforward focus of it, that she had not expected, and that she found, to her own mild surprise, easier to be near than she had anticipated. The work crew arrived at mid-morning, 6 wolves from the territory's outer building circle, skilled and efficient, and bringing good cedar from the same supplier as the original archers. Marmon stepped back into a supporting role the moment they arrived, without being asked, which Ralph Haskins registered and quietly noted in the margin of his working memory as the most promising thing he had seen from the Alpha King in about 3 years. The rebuilding took shape across the following days. The moonflowers that had survived in Kira's careful salvage came back the way deep-rooted things always do, quietly, steadily, slightly stronger for having been disturbed. Kira replanted from the cuttings she had gathered during the fire itself, from seeds in her grandmother's labelled jars, from divisions of herbs she had kept in the stone house for exactly this kind of emergency. Was a craftsman Harlan Doolin had found in the outer pack, a woman named Pearl Voss who worked in reclaimed cedar and had a gift for carved detail, built the new arches to match the originals so closely that the first morning Kira stood under the rebuilt entrance and looked up. She had to press her lips together for a moment before she could continue. The altar was repaired rather than replaced. The crack was filled with dark river clay that hardened to the same color as the original stone and left a visible seam. Silver dark, running diagonally across the altar face, impossible to miss. Kira had chosen not to hide it. She had chosen to preserve it as exactly what it was. A record. The seam was the story of what had happened, written into the stone itself, permanent and present, and not apologizing for being visible. Marmon was there the morning the altar repair dried. He stood looking at it for a long time without speaking. Marmon, you could have had it resurfaced, made it look like before. Kira, what happened, happened. The seam is the record. I don't want it erased. He understood that. He understood it more than she perhaps realized. He had spent 13 years trying to do what was correct, and the cost of a few of those years was now carried in the landscape of his own face and the specific quiet of the corridors he walked at night when the compound was asleep. Some things left marks. The marks were not the failure. The failure was refusing to look at them. By the 3rd week of rebuilding, Isaac Richmond was a regular presence in the Moon Garden. Nobody had arranged this exactly. It had simply developed, or the way things develop when a child decides something is interesting, with quiet inevitability and increasing specificity of opinion. Someone, most likely Rika Finch, who had a gift for delivering information at exactly the right moment, had told Isaac that plants could sense things, that they responded to the attention given to them, that a garden tended with genuine care was different from a garden tended by obligation, and that the difference was measurable if you knew what you were measuring. Isaac had taken this with complete seriousness. He now had opinions about individual plants. He had assessed each moonflower bed and reached conclusions about their emotional states that he reported to Kira, with the focused certainty of a child who has found a subject he considers genuinely important. But one afternoon, Marmon arrived at the garden entrance to find his son crouched beside the east bed with Kira, both of them examining a section of root near the soil line. Isaac was asking questions about root depth and soil composition with the rapid-fire consistency of a person who is not planning to stop anytime soon. Kira was answering each one fully, not shortening the answers, not simplifying them in the slightly condescending way adults simplify things for children when they want the questions to slow down. She was answering as if the questions were exactly as serious as Isaac believed them to be. Marmon stood at the entrance and watched. He stayed long enough that the afternoon light had shifted before either of them noticed him. When Isaac looked up and saw his father, he scrambled upright with the news. "What, Isaac Richmond? The ones in the far left corner are tired. Kira says they're going to need a long rest after bloom season, and we absolutely should not disturb them." "Marmon, I'll make a note of it, Isaac Richmond. I'm serious, father. They are tired. Marmon, I understand. I'll pass the word." Isaac, satisfied, returned to his assessment. Kira stood and brushed the soil from her knees. She looked at Marmon. "Kira, he's going to be an interesting alpha king someday." "Marmon, God help us all." Kira laughed. It was short and completely real, unguarded in the way that laughter is when it comes before a person has time to decide whether it's appropriate. It was the first time he had heard it, and something in his chest settled at the sound of it, the way a room settles when a window is opened after a long winter, and something that had been close and heavy suddenly had air. They stood together at the garden entrance as Isaac continued his very important botanical survey, and the afternoon light came through the new cedar arches at a long winter angle, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. By January, the moon garden had what Kira's grandmother used to call its second character. The look a place gets after it has been through something hard and found its way back, not restored to exactly what it was, because that is not the way recovery works, but changed in the manner of things that have survived a real winter. Deeper somehow, more fully itself, the kind of presence that only comes after a testing. The altar seam caught the frost each morning and turned silver in the early light, and from across the garden you could see it clearly, the record of what had happened, preserved in river clay, permanent. The moonflowers were dormant under clean mulch. The new cedar arches stood strong against the pale winter sky. The clay bowls, a new set, gifted one by outer pack members who had heard what had happened and arrived at the gate with quiet offerings and no expectations, stood throughout the paths in clusters. More wolves came now than before, not fewer. The gathering and what had been named in the stone ring had done something to the way the territory understood the Eastern Garden. It was no longer the place at the edge. It was the place that had always been central, and the pack was only now admitting what it had always known. Kira was at the garden when Marmon arrived on a cold January morning, or 2 cups of tea already made. She had heard his footsteps while she was still at the stonehouse fire, had made the 2nd cup without deciding to, had brought both out without examining why. Harlan Doolin's partner Lyra, who visited sometimes on her days off, saw the situation, picked up her herb order, mentioned a very pressing errand, and was gone with a speed that did not deceive anyone. They sat on the stone wall together, beside each other, not across, which was new, and both of them registered it without saying so. The garden was cold and quiet. A small bird was investigating the dormant moonflower bed with the focused optimism of a creature that has not accepted winter as permanent. Marmon, my mother is planning a formal recognition event for your official designation as Eastern Healer. Or she wants to do it properly, Kira. Let her do it. It matters to her, and it matters to me. A pause. Marmon, the formal part. It says you're protected by pack law and by me personally. That is the flaw. She looked at the garden, at the seam on the altar catching the winter light, at the small bird going about its hopeful work in the dormant bed. Kira, and above the floor? He turned and looked at her. The expression on his face was one she had been learning to recognize only recently, the one underneath the authority and the history and the carefully maintained composure of a man who has been watched for 13 years, the one that was simply Marmon Richmond, without the rest of it, trying to be honest about something, for which he did not yet have the right words. "De Marmon, I'm still working on finding the right words for that part." She looked back at the garden. There was the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Kira, take your time. I'm not going anywhere." They sat together in the January cold as the light moved across the arches, and the frost on the altar seam held its silver. Somewhere in the dormant east bed, without ceremony or announcement, weeks earlier than any of them had expected, one small white moonflower opened its face to the winter sky. Neither of them pointed it out. They simply stayed. In the weeks that followed, the work of accountability moved the way serious work does. Slowly, completely, without spectacle. Bess Turlow and Clyde Voss were brought before the pack elders in the stone ring under full documentation. Not they lost their positions and their territorial standing. They would not hold authority in Richmond territory again. Clovis Lambert, who had stood at Marmon's left hand for 4 years and arranged, in that position of trust, the poisoning of an 8-year-old child, was formally exiled to the outer boundary with no path back. Pack law, when it moved completely. Marmon attended every session of the proceedings, not for ceremony, because he had decided that if he was going to invoke justice, he needed to look at it directly, rather than hear about it after. Isaac, who was told the simplified truth that some people in the pack had done something wrong and that his father had made sure it was addressed, returned to his botanical work in the moon garden with increased focus. But by February he had developed a system for tracking the rest and recovery cycles of each moonflower section that he presented to Kira in a hand-drawn diagram with its own legend. She told him it was excellent research. He told her he was planning to expand it in the spring. She said she was counting on it. Valerie Richmond came to the garden on the day the last rebuilt arch was installed. She stood at the entrance for a long moment before walking in. She moved through the space slowly, touching the cedar of the new arch the way you touch something you thought was lost. When she reached the altar, she looked at the seam, the river clay record of what had happened, and her expression was very still. Valerie Richmond. Your grandmother would have approved of the clay, preserving the break rather than hiding it. But that was exactly her way. Kira. It was her technique. I learned it from her journal. Valerie nodded slowly. She stood in the rebuilt garden and let the morning light move across her. And after a while she said, "Valerie Richmond. He asks about you, you know. Not in an official capacity. He just asks." Kira considered the altar seam for a moment before she answered. "Kira. I know, I'm getting there." Valerie looked at her, and in the look was the particular warmth of a woman who has watched someone earn something slowly and recognizes the value of that slowness. She left without adding anything else. She did not need to. The garden breathed around Kira in the morning light. The rebuilt arches cast long cedar-scented shadows across the stone paths Leah had laid by lantern light in a different decade. The altar seam caught the frost. Or the moonflowers were dormant, but the roots were deep and the roots were strong, and when the season turned, they would bloom again, patient and white and entirely without grievance, the way they always had. The garden burned. The legacy did not. The roots held. They always hold. The end. If this story moved you, if you felt Kira's stillness in the ash, Marmon's reckoning in that study, or the weight of 3 generations of carried kindness, please leave a comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with one person who needs to hear a story about roots and repair right now. Stories like this one survive because of you. Thank you for watching.